Okay, welcome to this macro day of our PSE Policy Forum. I am Gilles Saint-Paul. I am the chair of sessions for this day, so it's a tough responsibility. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker of this morning, Olivier Blanchard. I don't know what to say about Olivier. You all know him. He has been a major contributor to macroeconomics. He has been professor at MIT for a number of years, and then he moved to the IMF, where he became a chief economist. He has written a number of seminal papers that have all been taught in our classes here and are used daily by our colleagues and students. And so it's a great pleasure for us to have him here, where he's going to tell us everything about inflation, something that has not existed for a number of years, like the Loch Ness monster is reappearing. So the floor is yours. You have up to 1 hour. You don't have to use it all. And then we will have the rest until 11:30, I believe, for a Q&A session.
Thank you for the kind words. I remember fondly our interactions when we went together at MIT. I'm going to present a paper which I wrote with Ben Bernanke, which we presented last month at Brookings. The paper is entirely about the United States. This was the mandate we had. But since then, as the paper has been presented, many central banks have thought, well, maybe we should do the same kind of exercise in our economy or in our country. And so there is a sequential project. I'm working with teams from the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the ECB to see how different or how similar it is to the US experience. We're not there yet, so it will just be 2 slides at the end. But it's clear that there is a more interesting question, which is, do we understand inflation in the various countries in which it has happened? Let me start with the theme of a paper. You have to go back in the US to early 2021, so 1 year after the beginning of COVID. And from the beginning of COVID, from March 2021 to March 2022, so both the Trump administration and then the Biden administration, there was a large number of large programs to basically help people and firms survive the implications of COVID. And the amounts are, I think, staggering. So Trump in March had March 2020 had a program which represented $2.2 trillion. Then he added something just before leaving in December, which was about $1 trillion as well. And then Biden in March 2021 introduced the American Rescue Plan at a time at which the economy was starting to recover of another basically $2 trillion. And these are extremely large numbers relative to US GDP, which was at the time around 22, 23 trillion. So in the face of this, the question arose of, well, how is it going to work? How much inflation is there going to be? And there were 2 groups. There was a large majority of economists, including economists at the Fed, who were fairly optimistic. And they said, yes, it may well be that this is going to increase aggregate demand quite a bit. People were sent checks of a fairly large amount. They are likely to spend some of it. But we don't have to worry too much because the wage Phillips curve, which is the effect of overheating or very low unemployment on wage inflation, is very weak. And so, yes, and what we're going to get is probably overheating, a strong economy, but not much inflation. And they didn't worry very much. There was a minority group which I call the pessimists, which I belong to, and there were a few other names associated with this, Di Summers, Jason Furman, who said, no, you cannot go by what we have seen happen over the previous 20 years where things were very quiet. The size of the demand increase may be so large that the relations which have held for the last 20 years are just not going to work at all. That when we get this degree of overheating, if unemployment goes to 2%, say, that things are going to happen. The Phillips curve is going to become more sloped. There's going to be more action on wages. Expectations of inflation are going to de-anchor, and what you're going to get is much more inflation than you expect. So we were a small minority, but we had these views. Now we basically know the outcome, and I actually see Ben and I have done our own slides, and I say both views were partly wrong, and I saw Ben's last night, and it says both views were partly right, which is true, both wrong and right, which is there was a lot of inflation, and much more than any of the optimists had anticipated, and it lasted much longer than they had anticipated. But the action didn't come so much from the labor market. What I'd had in mind was that unemployment would come down a lot. There would be a lot of wage pressure, a lot of wage inflation. Expectations would de-anchor. We're enforcing this. And this is where the inflation would come from. It didn't come from there. Basically, the labor market behaved more or less as the previous equations had suggested. No subsample instability of any sort. The action came from a goods market, which is that the overheating basically affecting the price of goods given wages. It was not wages, it was given wages. Prices increased a lot, and that took various forms, very large increase in commodity prices, and then a lot of price spikes due to shortages, which is very strong demand facing very hard supply because of supply constraints. So the result of this was a very large increase in price inflation, which did not come mostly from wage inflation, which came from the effect of demand through prices given wages. And I think that's the story. So what has happened over the last, 12 quarters, is that the quarter-to-quarter action has come very much from the price side. Big shocks to energy prices, big shocks to food, price spikes. That has been the action. So from month to month or quarter to quarter, this has been the focus of interpretations. But behind the scene, something has happened, which is becoming more and more relevant, which is that there still has been overheating in the labor market. Now, this is a much smoother, less visible effect. It affects wages quarter after quarter. It doesn't have these very large spikes, but it's there. And at this stage, what we have is wage inflation, which is too high if the Fed wants to go back to 2%, and the Fed has to do something. And as time has moved, and we're now in a phase in which the price shocks are much less important. Many of the commodity prices have reversed. Price spikes, shortages are less important than they were. What's appearing is the hidden part of the iceberg, which is the wage part. And so if I look forward and I assume that price shocks are going to fade or stabilize, then what remains is basically the wage inflation due to the history of overheating over the last 3 years or 2 years. And that has to be taken care of. And that's going to be much harder. So this is the paper, and I'll let you stop your phone. What we argue, I'll get into the specifics, is what does this imply for unemployment? That's relevant for the US. And we have a good sense of what this implies for another variable, which is the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, which we think is the right variable in thinking about the labor market. But the relation of the ratio of vacancies to unemployment to the unemployment rate is a rather complex one. It's what's known as the Beveridge curve, and it shifts a lot, and the question is what's going to happen to it. So we don't have a bottom line in terms of how much unemployment will be needed. We have more of a fan. but we think that more unemployment will most definitely be needed. Okay. Let me talk about the approach. So this is very different from a paper that you would submit to the AER or to the JP. Our goal was really to organize thoughts, organize data in such a way that we could tell a story and try to convince policymakers to think along those lines. So we made a number of choices. The first one is that we did not write down a model based on explicit micro foundations, because this makes the dialogue just too hard. But we think it's not inconsistent at all with micro foundations. We just didn't do it. So it's more, if you remember the models which were written by James Tobin, for example, in the 70s or 80s, this is more in that mode. It's plausible relations, which probably somebody could micro-found if one was eager to do that. The important thing is that we think that thinking about inflation, you have to think about wage behavior and price behavior separately. That the kind of reduced form Phillips curve, say the new Keynesian Phillips curve, which many of you must know, is not good, because really there is a lot of action in each of the two parts and they have to be thought of separately. So we have a wage equation, we have a price equation, which depends on wages, and then clearly what's crucial is expectations. And here we don't assume rational expectations, and we see no need to do this, given that we know what expectations have been. So we actually use actual series for expectations, both short run, say 1 year ahead, and then long run, which is 10 years ahead. And in the US, there's a choice of series you can use. So that's the conceptual frame. And again, I was struck when I had written them all, I went back to an article by Tobin in a book called The Economics of Price Determination, which was written in the mid-70s. And it's not fundamentally different. You can see this as terrible. We have made no progress, or maybe we were already in good place then. And it's good to be there. The second is on the estimation of them all. Here we've played by rules which are somewhere between a full structural estimation and a VAR. So a VAR is extremely agnostic except for the identification conditions. We thought that we needed to put more structure. So we took the analytical model, which I'm going to talk about, and just allowed for more dynamics. So basically 4 lags on any of the variables on the right-hand side. And we didn't play with it trying to get better fit or anything like this. What we did was to estimate that model, which is 4 equations, on the pre-COVID sample, so 1990 to 2019 fourth quarter, and then see how it predicted the rest of the COVID period, both by doing forecast and by doing subsample stability tests, in order to see, was what we have seen completely different, or was it basically not terribly surprising, given the shocks, given the price shocks, given the state of the labor market. Okay, so implications in terms of, I think, important ones in terms of thinking about the dynamics of inflation. If you look at, so what we're going to do is impulse response functions, as we're using the models, and decompositions of the movements between shocks. And I think there are 2 very important, in my mind, very important conclusions. The first one is price shocks were very big. It's not a surprise. The energy price shocks were big, more so in Europe, but still very big. Food as well, price spikes. But they had no lasting effect. They happen in a quarter, and they just don't last very much in terms of the effect of inflation. Just a one shot. By opposition, the overheating in the labor market. So if you have too tight a labor market, that has a very different dynamic. It basically builds slowly, but it builds, right? There's always a bit more pressure, and then the expectations adjust. And so you get very, very different dynamic responses. With respect to price shocks, big responses which don't last. With respect to labor market shocks, you get responses which build up, but are there in the end. the implication, and I already said this, is that if we move from a world in which the price shocks are less important, then the important dynamics become those of the labor market, the overheating, and that's harder to get rid of. I'm happy to take questions, by the way. Okay, this is a lowbrow paper, but let me just go through the model, which can be done in one page and will be familiar for most of it. So the only twist, but I think it's an important one and one that should be in any model, micro-founded or not, is the issue of catch-up, which is suppose that there is an adverse supply shock and prices go up. So the real wage, if nominal wages have not adjusted yet, is lower. What happens after? Do workers say, well, now we have a smaller real wage, but we start from there? Or do they say, we want our real wage back, right? Do we want to catch up? You know, we lost something because of the price of oil. We want it back. So the first one is basically the Phillips curve. Just ignore the past. And the second is what's known by Blanchard and Oswald, for those of you who have seen that literature, as the wage curve. But the important thing is once you have a series of adverse real shocks, which decrease the real wage fundamentally, do workers try to get it back through nominal wage increases or not? And it seemed to us that given the nature of what was happening, this was essential. So this captures that. So this says, basically the first equation says that the nominal wage is set as a function of the expected price level for the period in which you set the wage, think of 1 year, plus the aspiration wage, and the omega reflects the real wage, real aspiration, what you really want, right? And a function of the labor market, the X variable is some index of the labor market. So it could be the inverse of U, it could be something, I'll come back to what X might be, okay? And then the crucial equation is the aspiration wage. So the aspiration wage is assumed to be a weighted average of the previous aspiration wage, what you wanted before, and what actually has happened to the wage, the real wage. So you have omega A minus 1 last period, and then you have W minus 1 minus P minus 1, which is the real wage last period. Now, look at the two cases. If alpha is equal to 0, right, then there is no catch-up, and the aspiration wage is just your lagged wage, right? Alpha is equal to 0, 1 minus alpha is equal to 1. And so people say, well, you know, the wage is lower, we accept that, we revise our aspirations down, and we start from there. If alpha is 1, you say, no, we want the aspiration wage, and we're going to fight for it. And so the implication of this with the previous equation says we're going to ask for a nominal wage increase in order to try to get it back. And that's going to have an effect on inflation. Now, I've presented this as a discussion in labor economics, rather behavioral, but you get exactly the same discussion if you basically start from standard labor supply, and it's a question about income versus substitution effects, right? If you have a lower real wage, you have an income effect, you have a substitution effect. In the case of Cobb-Douglas, for example, there is no catch-up. Basically, you accept, you start from, but if it's not Cobb-Douglas, it may go one way or the other. Anyway.
It be that alpha be greater than 1 because of deciders, because of Blanchard and Summers, there could be alpha greater than 1.
Alpha, in a different line of work, I have explored the idea that if for some reason the real wage leads to a decrease in employment, or there's a decrease in employment, then the insiders might want to actually set a wage which is even higher than before. I've forgotten that period of my life, but you could probably integrate it. There are episodes in which hysteresis, which is what you're referring to, is central. So European unemployment in the past. I think for this, it's probably not terribly important, but maybe it is. Okay, so when you do this, you get a wage equation. And if you look at it, it's not exactly beautiful, but it's simple. The rate of wage inflation depends on the expected rate of price inflation, which is the first term. A term which is a catch-up term, which is that if you got screwed, basically, that the prices went up more than you expected and therefore your real wage went down, you want some of it back. That depends on alpha. And that depends on the labor market, which takes this form, in this case, x minus alpha, x minus 1. So that's the wage equation. Maybe I made it sound even more complicated than it is. Okay, the other equations are absolutely straightforward. The price equation is based on constant returns to flexible inputs. So you could actually modify this and has some fixed input like capital, but I don't think it would make much difference. And so in this case, you can basically write the price, and with a given markup, you can write the price equation as P is equal to W plus ZP. All these are in logs, okay, which is that ZP, for example, would be if you think of using labor and energy, then ZP would be the relative price of energy relative to the wage. So when you do this, you can write the equation this way, which is that the price depends on the wage and the relative price of energy. Could be the relative price of energy. If we're looking at the CPI, it could be the relative price of food. There's another element which might well come in the discussion, which is this is assuming a fixed markup implicitly. It's clear that there were shortages, and I'll show you data showing that. In this case, firms are basically facing the vertical marginal cost. Up to some point, they can produce, and then they're stuck. In this case, the price may go up even in a competitive market, given the cost. And in this case, what you get is an increase in the markup, which could happen in competitive markets just as much as in oligopolistic market. There's another line of explanation which you're surely familiar with, which says oligopolies or monopolies have used the opportunity to increase their markup. I'm skeptical of this, but that's not something we explore at length. Okay. So given them all, you can do simulations, and these are trivial to do, but I want to show you two simulations from the analytical model because I'm going to show you the empirical counterparts later. So this is the effect of an increase in the relative price of energy, a permanent increase in the price of energy remaining higher forever. So this is a one-time increase in the rate of change of the price of energy, right? So for 1 quarter, the energy price goes down by 40% and then stays there. What happens? Well, if there is weak feedback, so weak feedback corresponds to two assumptions in the model, that expectations do not respond. I actually did not talk about the expectation equations. I'm sorry, I should have. Let me go back. So wages depend on short-run price expectations, and we assume that short-run price expectations depend on pi star, which is long-run price expectations. You can think of this as the target of a central bank, of a perceived target of a central bank, and lagged actual inflation. Okay, so if delta is small, then you can see that most of the weight is on lagged inflation, and lagged inflation has a strong effect on expected inflation, which itself will have a strong effect on wages. If delta is close to 1, then the effect is very small. So the inflation increases, expected inflation doesn't move much, doesn't have much of an effect on wages. And then long-run expectation equation, which you can think of as reflecting credibility in a way of a central bank, again has the same form. It depends, pi star depends on itself and actual inflation. So anchoring would correspond to a value of gamma of 1, strict anchoring. You basically believe that no matter what, in 10 years, you will be at 2%, right? If gamma is positive and small, you adjust a bit, but not much. If gamma was very large, then you have the anchoring expectations, and then you can see how this is going to lead to dynamics, inflation leading to short-run expectations, long-run expectations, wage inflation, and so on. Sorry, I should have done this before, but now I can go back. So this shows the effect of a one-time permanent increase in the relative price of energy, say, and you have two lines. So the first one, the blue one, is basically this leads to more inflation, price inflation in the period in which it happens. And then what happens? Well, if expectations are strongly anchored, then people are say, well, it just goes, I'm not going to take it into account. And if catch-up is weak, then the fact that you have lost some real wage, you're not going to give much weight to it. So in effect, the effect is going to be very small on wage inflation and therefore on future price inflation. So you get a very strong effect, which is going to be very visible in the quarter in which it happens, but disappears very quickly. You have quarters at the bottom. If expectations are less anchored, then this increase, this peak of inflation is going to have more effect on expectations, more effect on wages. That's going to lead to a wage price loop. And if there's catch up in addition, then you're going to want to get more in order to try to get back what you lost. Okay, so these are the two, but keep them in mind when we go to the empirical way. Okay. This is the effect of an increase in X. So for the moment, I haven't told you what X is, but it's a variable which captures the tightness of a labor market. Yeah. So what we do in the model is we increase X above its natural value, the value which puts no pressure, and we just keep it higher. So think of it, I'm going to argue that we should use vacancy unemployment ratio, but think of it as the unemployment rate being 1% below its natural rate forever. And what you get is, again, a very different. What? Yeah, in the model it is. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole question of where how demand affected X, but that's not in the paper. So X is exogenous. And there you get two effects. You get the direct effect, which is the slope of a Phillips curve, right? If the unemployment is tight or the labor market is tight, then what you're going to get is more wage pressure. It is to some wage inflation. But you have the indirect effect, which is wage inflation leads to price inflation, which leads to revision of expectations, which leads to more wage inflation, and so on. And so again, you see that depending on the strength, basically, of the anchoring, you get two different responses. In both cases, inflation goes up, and the longer the labor market is overheated, the longer inflation goes up. So the blue and the red line both go up over time. But you can see that the blue one, which reflects fairly anchored expectations, is much lower. It's much less of an issue. To the empirical model. So what we do, we estimate, this is very old-fashioned stuff again. We estimate the four equations, equation by equation. We use quarterly data. And again, not to play with lags, we use 4 lags for all the right-hand side variables. This creates, a bit of movement in the impulse responses, but we think it's the way to do it. There's the issue of identification, and identification comes from a very simple assumption, which is wage inflation only responds to lagged variables. So within the quarter, wage inflation does not respond to unemployment, does not respond to expected inflation. It takes 1 quarter. Otherwise, with that assumption, it's like in a VAR, that's enough to actually identify all 4 equations, and that's what we do. I think that's a reasonable assumption. I think prices respond to costs much faster than wages to labor market conditions. The sample, we start in 1990, and that's an issue because as soon as you have the 80s, then you have a disinflation, which was a very different episode, and you suspect that things which happened then are probably not relevant now. In the main variables, I'm not going to go through the list, but I'm going to discuss a few of them. Price shocks. So the two which everybody will agree on is energy has become much more expensive relatively. So relative price of energy clearly is an important one. The relative price of food is also an important one. It's everywhere in the newspapers or every day. The question is the price spikes, the shortages. So that captures the fact that in many sectors there was at times the inability to produce. And so we looked for various variables, and there's a list of variables, and we ended up using a variable which does amazingly well, which is the Google Trends variable for shortage. It really fits. I mean, there are basically 2 quarters in which we know from anecdotal evidence and from econometric evidence that something happened which cannot be explained by the usual variables. And Google Trends, which you can do for the US, you can do for other countries, basically has very big shortage values for these 2 quarters. So we use that. Maybe it's a coincidence, but I think it actually captures something. Now I have to talk about X, and then we'll move to the estimation. X traditionally has been minus U, in effect, right? Low U, very tight X. If you look at the last 30 years, and you do a horse race between unemployment rate and the vacancy unemployment rate, the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, they basically behave about the same. They're highly correlated. And so there has been a discussion as to what the variable we should use is, but it doesn't make much difference. What has happened since the beginning of COVID is a very large shift between the relation, in the relation between V over U and U, which is a shift in the so-called Beveridge curve. And so that raises 2 questions. Which variable should you use, and what does it imply? And Peter Diamond and I, in another part of my life, have worked on that issue, and we convinced ourselves, I don't know if we convinced everybody else, but we convinced ourselves that the right variable is not U, it's V over U. It's basically the number of jobs looking for workers as opposed to the number of workers looking for jobs. And that seems like conceptually the right variable. There are plenty of empirical issues, which is that not all the people who get jobs come from unemployment, which is an issue both for unemployment and for the vacancy unemployment ratio. But we argued that that was the right variable. We didn't get a whole lot of traction. I mean, on theoretical grounds, I think it was clear, but empirically, it didn't make much difference. Now, basically, V over U, so U is basically back, the unemployment rate in the US, is basically back to where it was just before COVID, 3.5, more or less, 3.5%. So if you take that measure, there is no overheating, given that apparently there was no overheating just pre-COVID. If you look at V over U, it was at 1.2, it's now at 1.7. And so the question is, how do we interpret that evidence? And we argue, I've argued in a paper with Larry Summers, but we repeat the argument here, that suggests that as a result of COVID, matching is much worse. That basically you have a lot more reallocation and people trying jobs in sectors that they were not in, and it's harder to get people. In this case, what this means is that the right variable is definitely V over U, not U. And so we're going to use V over U, but that's a discussion we can have. The last assumption you have to make, or not make, but we made, is do you want, in the long run, do you want vertical Phillips curve? Namely, do you want to have a trade-off in the long run between unemployment and inflation? Now, in the short run, surely we do. But in the long run, it's open. On theoretical grounds, we think not, but some people think there might be one. What we have assumed is we have imposed an homogeneity restriction on these equations, on the sum of coefficients, so that in the long run, basically, there is no trade-off between inflation and the labor market variable, the vacancy unemployment ratio. It is actually, I was surprised. I thought that the data might not like it, but in fact, they are perfectly happy with it. It's not an issue, at least for the US. Okay? So the next few slides are about the estimation results, and I'll just show you highlights. So in the wage equation, we regress wage inflation on the rate of wage inflation, first variable, V over U, which is the variable for the labor market, the catch-up variable, the expectations, the short-run expectations, and a moving average of productivity. Now, let me not go through all this. The equation works well in 2 senses to get fairly significant coefficients. I mean, I basically give you the p statistics for the sum and for the joint set of coefficients each time. And you can see it works well. And it works well outside of sample. Namely, if you had estimated that equation, which you could have, pre-COVID and used it, you would be happy with it. It's not. Now, we can do this. Now, in terms of coefficients, what's striking, we find, so short-run expectations have an effect of 0.5, coefficients on the 4 quarters, sum to 0.5. So there's a fairly strong effect of short-run expectations on wage inflation. There's absolutely no effect of catch-up. We cannot find it. It may be that we didn't construct it right, but we didn't find any attempt by US workers to try to get back what they had lost.
What is the catch-up variable?
The catch-up variable is defined by the theoretical model, and it's basically the accumulated sum of inflation mistakes. Because the idea is, if a price was higher than your expected price, which we measure for...
That's the way you construct it for the regression.
Yeah. And you can think of more ambitious ways.
With the omega, you iterate the equation for omega, and you end up with an observable counterpart to omega.
Yeah, I should have said that. Yeah, you're right. Okay, but the point is, the wage equation really didn't blow up as opposed to what I expected to happen. This is the simulation, so this is the actual is the blue line. The simulation is a simulation. You take the equation as estimated pre-COVID, and you use the actual values of the right-hand side variables, and that's what you get, and you see that it works fairly well. There's one quarter in which it doesn't work at all, for reasons we fully understand, which is in the third quarter of 2020. The unemployment rate just exploded, as you know. I mean, not in Europe, but in the US, it went to 17%. The regression says there should have been a large drop in wage inflation. But in fact, people understood it was for 1 quarter, so it never happened. And there's nominal wage rigidity probably, which stopped it. But otherwise, it does fine. Let me talk about the price equation, I think, because I think that there are interesting things to say beyond just the estimation. So we have a part in the paper in which we actually look at the car industry. And the story is, I think, interesting and very revealing of some of the effects that took place. So if you look at the first graph, which is production, you see that in the, the second quarter of 2020, which is the lockdown, basically production collapsed and they basically could not produce. Right? So you get this very steep decline, which eventually is reversed, but is not reversed in integral part. So what happens? So they produce much less. People actually keep, so this is the second graph, keep buying cars. The result is lower production and strong demand leads to steadily declining automobile inventories. And you can see that the numbers are, again, fairly dramatic, which is that you start from 1 million and you end up at more or less 0. Okay. Then what happens in the second quarter of 2021? That's the first graph. You suddenly get a very large increase in the inflation corresponding to the price of new vehicles, right? It goes to nearly 20%. Okay. What happens? It seems highly correlated with the checks that were sent to people at the time. So you get that, but the problem is that the automobile industry is not able to respond to that, and therefore not able to respond to the demand. So what it does is basically there are shortages all over the place, and the Google trend variables for chip shortage and car shortage show that. And so what you get is basically very strong demand, partly due to the fiscal programs, partly due to the recovery, hitting walls, leading both to shortages and to very large increases in inflation for cars. As you know, the same thing, or you may know, the same thing is true of used cars. If you can't buy a new car, then you buy a used car, and you get a very large increase. So you can see that what seems to be true in that sector is strong demand, weak inventories, shortages of inputs, chips in particular, in the car industry, therefore leading to a very vertical supply curve, very large increase in inflation, very large increase in the relative price of cars relative to wages or anything that you want to normalize by. So I think this might be the most visible example, but there are other examples as well. Okay, so let me talk about the price equation. So a price equation is based on, if you looked, it requires CPI inflation, but as you may know, in the US, there's also a PCE. I think in most countries now there are two as well. Doesn't make much difference. So on itself, on the rate of growth of wage inflation, and the effect is fairly large. It's the first trend number in the table. And then the relative price of energy and the relative price of food. These are relative to the wage. And the shortage variable. So you have 4 reg coefficients, which I think are distill the important results from the graph. Now there's something interesting to do, which is compare the proper sum of coefficients, say, on the price of energy to the share of energy in the CPI. Now, if the sum of coefficients was exactly the same, you would say, well, it has a direct effect, but it doesn't have an indirect effect, which would lead to a larger coefficient than the share. And what we find in the paper is actually, it's fairly close to the share. It's about, the sum of coefficients is about 30% bigger than the share of energy and the share of food, which means that the indirect effects, the supply chain effects for the rest of the consumption basket are not very large. Now, this is the only exception to the using only the pre-COVID period, because pre-COVID there was no shortages. So if you estimate it pre-COVID, you don't get a coefficient. So for this one, we actually estimated on the whole period. If you use only the pre-COVID period, the coefficients on all the variables you can put in are very similar. And you can see that the fit is actually quite striking. And this is really without any cheating. And so what this says is price movement came very much from the price of energy, the price of food, and shortages. Now there's a question which we tried to solve, but I don't think that's the final word, which is, okay, so some people have said, some people who had some axe to grind, basically said, well, what you have found is that this had nothing to do with fiscal policy, because you've shown that the labor market didn't do anything crazy. And these are price shocks which have nothing to do with Biden or Trump or anybody. And we're skeptical. We think that the price movements that we have seen are not falling from the sky. They are basically due to very strong demand affecting commodity prices, affecting spikes. So what we did, which I think is somewhere between suggestive and a proof, is we took, if you think about commodity prices, so these are traded, there's no shortage issue in that case. There's an index in the US which has 19 commodities. Some of that is steel, some of that is agricultural food, and so on. And we said it's reasonable to think that what all these markets have in common is a common aggregate demand. If there's high aggregate demand, it affects all markets with different elasticities, but it affects. Where on the supply side, it's much more likely to be idiosyncratic. If, for example, you look at steel and copper, it's going to depend on whether a country which is producing copper is doing something, and in the case of steel, maybe a new mine has been opened. So we thought that if you assume that the common element to the 19 commodities is demand, aggregate demand, and the supply side are idiosyncratic, then you can use principal components and try to extract the common part of the movement in the commodity prices, and you can think of this as reflecting demand. So we did this, and you can see that up basically to the Ukraine war, it works very well. So the blue line is the actual, the red line is the CPI energy, these are the units are different here, but basically it goes up steadily up to the Ukraine war, and the principal component does the same again up to the Ukraine war. In the case, and after this, they both turn around. In the case of food, I think there is a puzzle, which I think is well known in the newspapers, which is that food keeps increasing even after the other commodity prices start going down. So the principal component turns down. Food has kept increasing, and understanding exactly why this is important. Now it's clear that, well, you know, the US is not Europe, and Ukraine is much more important for Europe. Ukraine is an important part of the story for the end of the period. Okay. Short-run expectations and long-run expectations works like a charm. Basically, these are estimated pre-COVID, and they, you know, when you use them to simulate what has happened, it works perfectly. The coefficient on inflation in the short-run expectations, or more precisely, the sum of the four coefficients is 12%. So this says that over a year, more or less, an increase of 1% of inflation will increase short-run expectations by 0.12%. So fairly anchored, I think, is. Then this all long-run expectations, again, works like a charm out of sample, and the effect on long-run expectations is not zero, so it's not full anchoring. And here again, I think there's a semantic issue. People talk about anchoring versus de-anchoring. It's a continuum. And the fact that it's not zero actually still matters when you have many, many quarters of high inflation. It adds up, even if it's small. You can see that the coefficient is small. It's basically 2 basis points for 1% inflation. So it's very small, but clearly it's there and it fits the data extremely well. Okay, so let me now go back to the impulse responses that I showed you in the analytical model, but now using the estimated equations. So what we do is we use the 4 estimated equations and we shock them and we get impulse responses. And I have done the following, which is I show you the big graph is the response. And what's striking is that it doesn't last. You get an increase in the price of energy, the blue line, which is very big. This is 1 standard deviation during COVID. But after 1 quarter, it's basically gone. So there is not the kind of worry that we had, which is it starts something in which expectations adjust and so on. And that comes from the lack of catch-up and from the fact that expectations are very, very anchored. Okay. So I've done this so that you can compare it to the analytical one, which is clearly nicer and smoother, but it looks much more like the blue line than the red line. This is the counterpart to the experiment in which we tightened the labor market and looked at the answer. So in the top right, you have what we had seen before, and you get the response of a shock to a permanent increase of 1 standard deviation in the vacancy unemployment ratio. And you can see that you get a big effect, and I show it to you only for 16 quarters, but if you keep going, it keeps going up, not very fast, but basically keeps going up. So it's much more jagged than the one. When you do analytical models, it always looks very nice. But when you do empirical ones, they look less so. There is, just as a footnote, if you estimate the wage equation, the coefficients on U or on the other U are very jagged. They kind of positive, negative, which suggests, I think, maybe some other differencing of something. And if somebody was working on this, I think this would be very good. But that's what the model does. Okay, so the conclusion is, in reality, just as in the analytical model, the price shocks have big effects contemporaneously, but they disappear. And the wage shocks, or the labor market shocks, have effects which build up. So this gets me to the bottom lines in a way, which is we can use them all and do a decomposition of price inflation and wage inflation between what we take as exogenous, and maybe you could be more ambitious, but the price of energy, the price of food, shortages, V over U, and we just look at the effect, right? So this is using the equations. So if there were no residuals, this would explain things perfectly, but you can see that there's a difference between the line, which is the actual price inflation, and the sum of the bars, which is what is implied by them all. But remember, this is a tough exercise. We use the equations pre-2020. We do not take into account what has happened since in terms of estimation. Now, there's a very clear message, I think, coming from this, which is that if you look at quarter by quarter inflation, then clearly this has been dominated by the yellow, the blue, the light blue, not by the red. So yellow, blue, light blue are the price shocks, the energy price, the food price, the shortages. The yellow is the shortage, right? That has completely dominated the scene. Now, behind the scene, the red is apart from the labor market, right? And as you can see, initially, actually, the labor market was depressed. V over U went down to 0.2 relative to 1.2 before COVID. So you get negative bars, but they're small. This is the red bar. And then it becomes positive, but it's small. So that if you look at the decomposition, most of the action is not from the labor market, but it comes from these price shocks. You can do the same thing for the wage inflation. And here, clearly, the effect of the over U are stronger because they affect wages directly. You can see that they are negative. And the effects of price of energy and the price of food and the spikes are relatively small. And the reason, again, is that the way they would work is when there's an increase in the price of energy, then what happens is expectations adjust, but they don't adjust very much. So it doesn't have much of an effect on wages. So this is what you get. Okay. Now, this looks like, okay, so the labor market was not so important. But unfortunately, if you think about what's going to happen, the yellow presumably is going to go away. Shortages are going to disappear. Food prices, energy prices are starting to stabilize. Well, they have decreased, but they're going to stabilize. And we're going to be left with the red part. And unfortunately, the red part is a bit too high to be consistent with 2% target inflation. So the last thing we do is to look at various paths. And I want to emphasize that these are not forecasts, but these are conditional projections. We say, we're now today, and let's assume that the price shocks from now on are zero, that the shortages are equal to their mean pre-COVID, never quite zero, but small. And we look at different values of V over U. So V over U today, when we wrote the paper, it's now a bit lower, it's 1.7, was 1.8. And so if we just take the model forward, what we see is that overheating leads to an increase in inflation, right? This is price inflation, and we end up at 4.7% or something like this in 27. So if we keep overheating, then it keeps building up. That's not a great surprise, but it gives you a sense of magnitude. If we go to 1.2, which is the pre-COVID, which is kind of the natural, if you want, natural vacancy unemployment ratio, as opposed to the natural rate of unemployment. And then basically we stabilize things, but we don't improve things because we actually need to make the labor market worse in order to get somewhere. If we get the labor market down to, so VU star I'm not going to explain, but roughly 0.8, then you can see that we start decreasing inflation, but it takes a while. And by 25, we're still at 2.5%, which is above the official target of the Fed. And then if we really go at it and have a really sharp recession, and we get VU to go down 2.3, we do this over 8 quarters. So we decrease VU so that it ends up at 0.3. Then we get to target. But that's a very, very low value of V over U. Now, the last point is very low value of V over U. What value does this imply for U? And that depends very much on whether the beverage curve shifts back or stays where it is. If it stays where it is, it means substantially higher unemployment, right? And the reason is that the good news on the upside was the Phillips curve, the wage Phillips curve is very flat. The effect of the labor market on wage inflation is small. So on the way up, the effect was small. But now on the way down, it is equally small, which means that you actually have to have fairly high unemployment or a high vacancy unemployment rate, a low vacancy unemployment ratio in order to get where you want. So maybe things turn out better. Maybe these conditional projections are not the right ones. But the message is, I think that I've seen the expression being used at the Sintra meeting. The last mile, if you want, is likely to be costly. And I think that's a message. Okay, so let me just say a word about what happens when we talk about the UK and the Eurozone. Yeah, it's fine. So far, I wish I had more to present, but we're not there yet. What's common to the UK and the Euro, I don't have the Japanese results yet. They're likely to be quite different given that Japan didn't have inflation. Most of the action is in the price equation, like in the US, rather than the labor market equation. Like in the US, there is slow building of pressure in the labor market. And in the UK, I think it's fairly convincing. The vacancy unemployment ratio is really higher than it has ever been. I'm less convinced that that's as important in the Eurozone, and we'll have to do more work. The good news is central banks are credible. Expectations, so the equations for expectations are nearly identical to the US ones. They haven't moved. And basically, and even in the UK, long-run expectations are nearly fully anchored. You just don't see any effect of price inflation, which is somewhat surprising, but good news. We find no evidence of catch-up anywhere. It may be a bad specification, maybe something else. And so the implication is the same, which is as the price shocks fade or disappear, the problem is going to be the labor market, and that's what may be difficult to slow down. Among things that I may want to mention, two remarks. I mean, when you take a model and take it to another country, you're not sure that it's going to work. I mean, because you've been thinking in, you know a country well. In the UK, wage equation doesn't work at all. And it's clear that the process of wage formation is different. And it's clear that the way we've gone at it doesn't work for the UK. So I think there are interesting issues there. And then the other interesting question is, in the UK, is a very, very large effect, measured effect of shortages, much more so than in the US or the Eurozone. Whether it's for, again, it's constructed using the Google Trends variable for shortages UK. So you may be skeptical, but it is striking, and one worries about Brexit and some implications of that. And that's it, and then there's a conclusion. So this basically shows you the slide for the US, what you saw, and this shows you the corresponding slide for the UK, and if we had time we could look. Basically very much the same, at, not exactly each quarter obviously, and stronger energy shocks in the UK than in the US. That's proximity to Ukraine, and we understand that. The conclusions. So there's, I get inquiries from journalists telling me, well, we have to start from scratch. We don't understand macro. Inflation is ununderstandable. I think a lot of this comes from not having been there when there was inflation, which is the remark that Gilles made at the beginning. Most of the people working now do not remember Volcker and Thatcher and others, but it is not very different, and the framework we have, I think, is fine. I think we learned something, which is that you should not focus only on the labor market. That when demand is very strong, the assumption of a fixed markup, for example, is clearly not right, and we have to think about it. And then the other two are looking at the future. The rest, if they really want to go to 2%, and I have some doubts, it might be difficult to do it without further increases in interest rates, but that's a different issue. Thank you.
Okay, so we are now ready to take questions from the floor.
From this work, does that mean that should we be more lenient during the last mile, or should we be more persistent or more aggressive initially to prevent second round effects? So what kind of recommend? Because you didn't mention that in your presentation. What kind of recommendation?
I'm going to be careful talking about the euro because this was, and I think things are different in different places. The last mile is going to be difficult because again, the trade-off between unemployment or vacancy unemployment ratio and wage inflation is very unattractive. You have to have a lot of unemployment in order to get action. As you may know, I have suggested a really simple solution to this, which is one doesn't need to run the last mile. One could actually stop, or could walk the last mile. This is the issue of target inflation. For many reasons, and I think you're aware of what I've argued for many years now, is I'm not sure that the 2% target is best in a world in which we are likely to hit the zero lower bound again. And therefore, if we decided that there is no last mile and we stop at 3, that would make your job much easier. I think the issue is going to come. I suspect that's not what central banks are going to choose, but they may slow walk the last mile, is my sense. Because I think running the last mile to get to 2% inflation in a year is going to be very, very difficult.
So maybe I will ask my questions. I have many, but I will only ask 2 because one is, well, I was born with inflation like you. And in the 70s, there were the oil shocks, and we said, look, energy prices caused a burst in inflation. And then when I started studying economics, there was a sort of revisionist literature that said, look, you know, quantitatively that does not add up because energy is important, but it's not so important. And if I multiply this by, you know, the share of energy in GDP, it does not explain that much. And if I understand correctly, your slides ascribe a large part of the inflation burst to energy prices. And so isn't this, you know, subject to that same critique? Or maybe that critique was wrong, just people trying to write papers. But
of which I wrote a few. No, I think that you can have a coherent story for, does it work?
Yes.
A coherent story for the 70s, the 90s, and today, which is, I think, in all cases, when there's a sudden increase in the price of energy, then within the month in which it happens, or the quarter in which it happens, mechanically, it gets largely into the CPI. So that part is very strong. The question is, what happens after? And what happens in the 70s is that started, there was a big effect, and then it kept building up, and it stayed for a while until basically there was contractionary monetary policy. So that depends on catch-up, and it depends on expectations anchoring. In the 70s, there was more catch-up, and that came from the fact that there was formal indexation. Formal indexation basically forces catch-up, right? Because it basically, I mean, depends on the formula, but typically it basically gets you back some of what you lost. So in the presence of indexing rules, then this initial shock built up, and then there was very little credibility of central bank, so I have not done the regression but I would expect that the expectations were more sensitive to what actually happened than they are today. So I think the difference is in the 70s, you had catch-up, you had strong unions, you had indexing rules, and that led the initial shock, which is always there, is even there today, just to build up and then disappear, and this is gone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then my other question is, you showed us the role of V over U, especially on the labor market side. And if I look at wage growth and price growth, we see that the real wages are falling very fast. So could it be that there is a sort of goodwill, cycle dimension there, in that V over U is precisely high because at the end of the day, labor right now is relatively cheap. And in the future, we might expect wage growth to pick up. It's a bit the story that you told. And then that is likely to reignite inflation. But in some sense, there is an endogenous dimension to the current level of V over U.
Can I say that I think you're wrong?
Of course. That does not mean I am wrong. It just means you think I am wrong.
Real wages are lower because prices have increased more than wages, and because there has been an increase in the price of another input, which is a cost to firms. So the cost of production hasn't come down. So simply more of it comes from energy and less of it comes from labor.
Right, that's possible. You have an adverse supply shock and real wages have to fall, and that's it. And so this fall in real wages does not increase labor demand, but we see that V over U is high, right?
Yeah. The story that real wages are very low, so it's incredibly attractive, so firms are putting a lot of vacancies. Doesn't strike me as relevant.
But
real wages are low, but the cost of producing is higher because you have to pay more. But you
told us that if V over U stays the same, we are going to have 5% inflation.
Yes.
So in some sense, V over U is above the natural rate of V over U. Right?
Yes, but my sense is...
And that could be because W over P is lower than its equilibrium level.
Okay, so it may come from the fact that I think of V over U as being determined by aggregate demand, not by wages. The reason why wages are not irrelevant is that this in turn puts pressure on wages and eventually leads to a movement in wages. But my Keynesian view of the world is that when I think about V over U, I think about aggregate demand. And therefore, if I see a very high V over U, I don't think low real wages or anything like this. I think fiscal policy.
Right. But the question is, in a simple static model, you would have a fall in W induced by the increase in the price of, complementary inputs. That makes perfect sense. But if you don't have catch-up, it means you have a lot of inertia in the formation of wages, and it could be that there is more than this. It could be that W over P has fallen too much relative to that benchmark.
It may be that W over P has fallen too much. That's possible, and some of the numbers on profit might be taken as some indication. Yes, that's not inconsistent.
Okay. Yes, Klaus.
So there have been these news stories about why wage price, well, I'm not sure they're so new, but the wage price stories spiral may get going, and that's the story about conflict between firms' profits and workers' real wages. And even Werning and Guido Lorenzoni, and you have been a proponent of that also. So, but in your setup, the lack of catch-up dynamics in the wage equation, wouldn't that speak to this not being there, or haven't we just not yet seen this?
It means that the workers have lost in the conflict.
But
when you have, so think of a world in which there are two inputs, labor and something else, and the price of the other input goes up, something must happen to what the other two parties get, the profits and the wages, right? That's how. So what happens, I think, typically is each side wants to reestablish their margins or their real wage, and that's where the conflict comes from. Now, the form of a conflict will depend very much on how aggressive each side is. When I say there has been no catch-up, it means in effect that there has been no reaction, no visible reaction from an econometric point of view of wages. So they basically have accepted much of the loss, right? Yes, I mean, so there has been conflict, but workers have lost in that way.
But isn't conflict just a situation where we can't agree on how to share the losses?
Yeah, I mean,
And have we now agreed or have we not agreed that wages need to be lower? Or?
sorry. So we agree that when the price of another input, say imported input to be so something outside, goes up, then there is less to share, right? So the question is, how do we do this? Now, the way to do it, and I've written on this, right, is to sit down and decide that we're not going to do it for inflation, that firms are going to accept lower profits for a while, and workers are going to accept lower real wages, and we all go home happy, and there is no inflation. The way it actually happens in our economies is for inflation. Each tries to basically get back what they had, and if they try to do this, then there is no possible outcome. Inflation keeps increasing. But if one side basically gives up, which is what no catch-up is, then the process comes to an end, with one side being in better shape than the other.
Okay, so now the floor is heating up, so we have lots of questions.
Thank you, but maybe they were okay. I'll ask a question. Thank you. Then okay.
Yes. So first of all, I'd like to say that as a student, it was an honor listening to you. Well, I had two questions. So first of all, to what extent do you believe that the rise in interest rates was effective to try to curb inflation insofar as it's not mainly a monetary inflation that we are facing? And that leads me to the second, well, not to the second question, but to the second part of the first question, the fact that we used a lot fiscal policy to curb inflation. So that's very interesting because with the tariff shield, we saw that fiscal policy had an important role. And so which durable tool could we use? Because I think that the fiscal policy will not be lasting as it was shown with tariff shield that ended. And second question, which is part of a small answer, you wrote a paper proposing 4% inflation. And so in this paper, you did not mention the role of inflation to curb public debt, but do you believe that inflation could be a solution to decrease the public debt or not?
On the third one, first, I now think 3% is better than 4%, because I've concluded that between 3 and 4 you get salience of inflation, and salience of inflation changes the expectation process. But I'm still at 3 and not at 2 yet. No, I don't think, I mean, as we know, unexpected inflation can decrease debt, and that's exactly what has happened over the last 3 years, but it has to be unexpected inflation. So it really is not conceptually the same as the discussion about the target inflation. On the first question, monetary policy in the context of shocks like we've had. So it's clear that monetary policy can do nothing, nothing obvious anyway, to counteract the initial increase in inflation coming from the price of energy or the price of food or the price spikes, right? So that I think it has to actually accept and not fight. Why would it want to do more than that? Why would it want to do something? For two reasons. The first one is if there's overheating at the same time in the labor market, then it has to take care of that, right? Now, it's not going to do anything to the price of energy or anything like this, but it has to be taken care of. Even if there's no overheating in the labor market, which I think some people would believe is the situation in the Eurozone, then you still want to do something because you don't want people seeing the very high increase in inflation to change their expectations. So you actually have to indicate that you're totally committed to your target, and words may not be enough, and you may have to increase interest rates. Now, this is a case in which you're not trying to slow down the economy. This is basically a signal that you'll do whatever, that, yeah, inflation is high today, but you're not going to accept it. And it may be that you need to increase rates. And there was a question in between, but I forgot. Oh, fiscal. So on fiscal, I mean, two remarks. The first one, and I'd written on this with Jean Pisani, Ferry, which is, I think it was a very good idea to use fiscal policy to partially compensate people for the loss of income. The reason is human, I mean, for obvious reasons. The second is that I think it decreases the potential catch-up. Basically, if you get your money through the state, you don't need to ask it through nominal wage increases. So I'm not sure that there's any strong relation, but you know, if you have a loss in income, you basically have two ways of trying to make it up, right? One is you ask for more, or the other is you receive a check from the government. Now, checks from governments are not the solution to everything, but in that case, I think it was justified. So using fiscal policy to limit inflation, which is what happened in France, as you know. I mean, the inflation rate in France was lower than elsewhere, I think was a very good idea. In the current context, this is a remark about the US, you know, the notion that it's the Fed which has to decrease the activity shouldn't be taken as a given. There's fiscal policy as well. And it could be done by, you know, a fiscal consolidation at the same time as monetary tightening. And there are extremely good reasons in the US to want to have a fiscal consolidation because we are, as you know, I'm a dove on public finance issues, but in the US is on a path where debt is likely to explode unless something is done.
So now energy prices have gone up and down, but eventually they might have to go up if we want to have some structural reallocation towards green sectors. That seems to be one of the objectives of Europe, the world in general. So first there is this. So energy prices might have to go up. And second, permanently up, maybe. And second, we want, not all sectors are going to be homogeneous, right? Some sectors are green, others are brown. And so maybe we want some workers or some workers in some sectors to catch up. We want higher wages to speed up a reallocation process if there are costs to this reallocation. In other sectors, wages in other sectors, perhaps it's better if they stay down so that, you know, we facilitate this reallocation. So thank you.
Okay, there are two parts. The first one is, are we going to have steady increases in the relative price of energy? And is this going to lead, I suspect the question was, is this going to lead to more inflation? The answer is no. And the reason is that you do not think of inflation over the long run as being determined by productivity growth, for example, because you think that workers will eventually adjust, right? So this is exactly the same. And from the point of view of the workers, lower productivity growth or a higher price for gas is the same. So we assume, I think, that eventually workers accept what they face. So, yes. But I mean, historically, I think, you know, we haven't seen inflation move with inversely with productivity growth over long periods of time. So I think it's in the same. So if for some reason the workers wanted to catch up a bit more, then the responsibility of this man here and his friends would be to increase unemployment a bit in order to make sure that there is enough pressure to keep inflation at the same level. In the end, the 2% is a decision of central banks. And there is an unemployment rate or a vacancy unemployment ratio, which does it. If they are serious about it, and for some reason we get these shocks, they have to tighten, right? If they catch up. Your other question was on reallocation. And there, I think, again, theory is absolutely straightforward, which is if there is more reallocation, any labor market model tells you that the natural rate of unemployment or the natural vacancy unemployment ratio, natural rate of unemployment will be higher, and the vacancy unemployment rate ratio will be higher, right? In which case you have to adjust for that and accept the fact that unemployment is a bit higher. So again,
Yes. So all the action, I understand, in your model comes from the supply, what's happening on the supply also.
No.
But in the auto inventories figure, the auto inventories were already declining in 2018, 2019. So there are a lot of demand also decreasing maybe in the US and increasing somewhere else or fluctuating, say, in China. So how would you take into account?
Again, at the beginning of a sample I showed you, the level of inventories, which may have been lower than it was before, is still 1 million cars. And at the end, it's about 100,000, right? So that's what happened. Now, it may be a trend, but we also know that there was a large decrease in production. So that would explain most of it. So again, I showed you, part of the story, but that's a part of the story I need for what I'm looking at. But I disagree with your first sentence, which is you showed this was mostly supply. I don't think it is. I think one thing we've basically been taught is demand and supply, right? And if there hadn't been higher demand in 2021, then it's not clear that there would have been the same shortages. I think the fact that there's a peak in demand at the time, more or less the 3 months after the Biden administration sent checks to people, suggests that demand played a big role. Now, in normal times with large inventories, automobile firms would have been able to basically deplete inventories, but they didn't have them, right? And so they had to ration, and when they rationed, there was shortage and very high prices. So I think it's really the combination of strong demand. Again, the timing is striking. The big increase in demand, the big shortage, is in the 3 months which follow the checks.
Do you think it would be relevant to include the exchange rate in your model and the story? So the basic hypothesis would be to say that in the US case, it might explain why this price shocks is very temporary because it hedges very well. But there might be also issues for the labor markets. Secondly.
So we have ignored the exchange rate, which I think for the US, it is reflected in the CPI components for energy and so on, right? But we have not explicitly put it in the model. One of the issues when you deal with the UK, when you deal with the euro, is whether you should not be more explicit about the role of imported goods and their price. And I suspect that's part of the story. I think for the US, it's not first order, but we could have done it. We didn't.
It was just a two-hand related to Klaus' question. And because just to mention that in Europe and especially in France, a puzzle has been the fact that employment so far has been too strong relative to output. And so that means that you were saying, maybe employees have lost, but if you take into account employment or if you look at unit labor cost, you have a different story. There had been, as if, there had been a kind of different preferences between wage increase versus keeping jobs or just some kind of labor hoarding behavior from the part of employers. So it changed if you look at total payroll as opposed to just wage per employee. You have a different story, especially in France.
Okay. But let me just make one last remark on this. You'll note that in the analytical model, we don't have productivity growth. In the empirical one, we have to have it because it actually matters. And it's very puzzling what productivity growth has done during COVID across countries. In the US, it went up enormously and has been dismal since. In Europe, it's quite different. Sometimes it's just the reverse. Understanding, I suspect that's a more important part of the story. And here we treat it in the background and don't talk about it. But I suspect that there's much more to look at and differences across countries.
Okay, thank you very much for this session. Thank you, Olivier. I think we can clap our hands.